Hi, Todd VanDenburg here with VanDenburg Capital Management and another Uncommon Sense update. Well, while these updates are uncommon sense, the last several weeks they've been fairly repetitive, so here I am again. China, China, China. The tension with China right now seems to be at an all-time high with the quote trade war that we're engaged in with China. A report just came out where China said, you need to be careful because we're warning you. We're going to do things that you might not like in retaliation for the U.S. Increasing tariffs on Chinese goods. So there's two of the things that they've have sort of been bandied about here most recently in the last couple of days, and so I wanted to touch on those to sort of give you some perspective on what might China be able to do in addition to putting tariffs on our goods and services, which I've already talked about. So there's sort of two things. I'll start with the one that isn't talked about very often, and that is that China is the producer, largest producer on the planet of rare earth metals and rare earth materials. And these materials are used in all kinds of technology, iPhones, things like that. And if China decides that they're just going to not export any more of those materials, that could actually have an impact on companies like Apple and other companies that rely on these rare earth metals. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other countries that produce rare earth materials, metals. The United States, Australia, Russia, Vietnam, many other countries. The hard part is that most of those countries are not really friendly to the U.S. So China does have a little bit of leverage there. Again, in the grand scheme of our total gross domestic product, the amount of rare earth metals and materials that we import is not a significant percentage, but it could cause some disruption. So that's something we're going to be watching really closely. It is a lever they could pull to try to hurt us. The second lever that I often hear people talk about is, well, China is the largest holder of the U.S. national debt. So what if they just sold it all, dumped it all in the open market? So the first thing that we need to understand is that the U.S. has about $22 trillion of total outstanding debt. China, being the largest global holder of our debt, they hold about $1.2 trillion of our debt. So that's a real amount of money. It's roughly 5% of the total outstanding debt, but it's not something where if they decided they were going to play a game with us, where it's going to end our economy. Here's what would likely happen if they did decide to just dump all of the bonds that they currently hold and dump them on the open market. So the first thing that happens is you can't sell them if there's not a buyer. And the US being the world reserve currency, there are plenty of countries that would buy up that $1 trillion of debt. The problem for China is that if they dump it all in the market at one time, when the law of supply and demand says, if you increase the supply greatly, the price falls. So that means the price that they'd get for these bonds would continue to fall until they'd sold all of them. So if the bond prices fall and the value of those bonds falls because of the inverse relationship of interest rates to bond values, the interest rates on those bonds would immediately go up. Now, how high? That's hard to say, but let's assume that the 10-year Treasury is sitting around 2%. So let's say that they sell the $1 trillion worth of bonds, and now we're sitting at a 10-year Treasury of 5%. So let's say that them dumping the bonds causes the 10-year to go from 2 to 5. Well, that's not really good for the U.S. Treasury, because the U.S. Treasury, we as the United States of America, we spend more than we collect in taxes. So the government keeps borrowing money, and they finance that borrowing with the issuing of new treasuries. So if yields go from 2 to 5, the Treasury is now going to have to pay 5 in order to get these new bonds sold. So over time, over the next 5 to 10 years, if that actually happens, that could cause the U.S. Treasury and the interest that we pay on our debt to start to increase and increase to a point where it potentially causes our economy some issues. That's a 5 to 10 year out problem, but it is, again, something that we'll be watching because it's not good. If the government's going to spend more than it brings in, then these low interest rates, for the government at least, is sort of a gift. But here's the flip side to it. There's, I don't know, a generation worth of retirees who haven't been able to earn nearly anything on CDs and even treasuries because interest rates have remained so low. So if the 10-year treasury goes from where it is now 2 to 5, CD rates are going to go up too. And every other yield is going to go up. And what that means is that there's now going to be a lot of places where you can actually earn 5% on a fairly low risk or risk-free investment, something you haven't been able to do for roughly 10 years. So yeah, there's good and bad to this, but what I really want to emphasize now is these two sort of what they call nuclear options, dumping all of our treasuries or holding on to the rare earth materials and metals that they might otherwise sell to the US. If China goes down that road, there are other sources of rare earth materials that we can get that stuff from, likely at a marginally or even a nominal increase in cost, but those materials are available. And if they dump all of our treasuries in the open market, that's not going to have an immediate negative impact on the US. It would cause a rising interest rate environment, would certainly do the Federal Reserve's jobs for it. They wouldn't have to raise rates, but it's not going to crater the U.S. economy. The average yield on a 10-year treasury has been, 5-ish% for the history since the government's been issuing treasuries. So it isn't that a 5% treasury yield is somehow bad for the U.S. economy. Heck, if you go back into the 70s, you could find treasuries that were paying 13%, and that was bad. So as you're hearing all this stuff about, China has the upper hand, China's going to stick it to us, and just think about, sort of the fact, everybody agrees to this. China has had the upper hand and has been taking advantage of us from a trade standpoint for decades. This isn't a, left, right, conservative, liberal thing. It's decades, multiple presidents. They've been taking advantage of us. Everybody agrees to that. The second thing that everybody agrees to is China has been stealing our intellectual property, again, for decades. Everybody agrees to that. Well, except China. So if those two things are true, and most people agree that the US economy is pretty strong, if we can't hold China accountable for these actions now, when can we ever do it? And if we give in now, we literally have set them up because they know that we're going to cave if they make it too hard on us. Now, granted, China has a different political system. The leaders in China, they don't have to be accountable to their people. There's no elections that's going to vote the president out. In the United States, every 2 years, we vote people out if we think they're not doing a good job. And China's sort of banking on that weakness in the United States, is that we won't stay the course and hold them accountable and make them treat us fairly. So just keep that in mind. If a little bit of pain comes, you just have to understand, it's sort of like if the 6-year-old in the back of the station wagon is crying and says, "Give me ice cream," if you pull that car over and you give that kid ice cream, you've determined your fate for the rest of your life, because all you're going to get is a screaming kid every time they want their way. So if you have any questions about this, I mean, our relationship with China and the potential impacts to the stock market and the U.S. economy are pretty complicated. Just give me a call, email me, text me, reply to this message. I'll happily try to share more information, but it's just super important that people not get overly concerned just because the media says that this is the end of the world, because it's really not. This is the U.S. standing up for its rights in the global market. So that was your update. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give us a like, give us a share, and I'll be back next week with another Uncommon Sense update. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to be the first to hear of more Uncommon Sense updates like these, please click the subscribe button below. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again.